Hi, I'm Jason Donner from the University of Calgary. I'm going to be talking about agriculture, energy, and climate. The experts agree the climate is changing. It's real. It's our fossil fuel use that's doing almost all of it. It's us. It's also bad. Fires, extreme heat, floods, other natural disasters like hurricanes are going to be increasingly a problem. And I want to be clear that Saskatchewan's agricultural industry can be a big help with this. As a physicist, I like to say that the universe is made of nothing but matter and energy. Matter, of course, comes from nature. If it was living, fairly recently, then it was probably either grown on a farm or possibly from a forest. If it's non-living, it was probably mined. Saskatchewan, of course, does a fair amount of both the farming and the mining. For example, Saskatchewan is responsible for 25% of the world's uranium production in a single mine here in northern Saskatchewan. That's roughly 1/10 of the world's carbon-free electricity. Kind of amazing. This is the world's largest high-grade uranium ore supply, and for as extensive as Saskatchewan's contributions are to this, you could walk around this entire mine at the surface in under an hour. To be clear, this uranium has within it more energy than all of the natural gas and all of the oil that Canada winds up exporting if we put the uranium in one of the new Canadian small modular reactors that's currently being designed. Matter doesn't just come from nature, energy comes from nature as well. No matter which of these innovative renewable technologies we're talking about, all of them wind up being from nature. I also want to be clear that whether we're talking about tidal, most geothermal, wind, solar, hydropower, and even ocean current power, what it's really used for, with the exception of some forms of geothermal, is electricity. When we're looking at our fuels, what we can say is that we, broadly speaking, have two choices. We can have the type of fuels that pull carbon from the ground and release it into the atmosphere in a way that's changing the environment, our so-called fossil fuels, natural gas, oil, and coal, or we can have fuels that don't have a net release of carbon dioxide, which is to say nuclear fuels, like the uranium found in Saskatchewan, and of course biofuels, like the canola, which is coincidentally also found in Saskatchewan. Unfortunately, nuclear, much like coal, is really just good for electricity. Now, in the future, it'll probably be good for some process heat, which could combine with agricultural things to agricultural residue to produce more things. But for the most part, what nuclear is really good at is electricity and could probably do a fair amount of the heating for industrial processes. But oil's used for something else as well. Actually, it's not just used for transportation fuels like your gasoline for your car and your kerosene for your airplanes or your diesel for trucks and heavy equipment. Oil's not really used for electricity, which makes the electric outlet there sad. In addition to its energy use, though, oil is also used for all sorts of petrochemical feedstocks, from plastics to medicines to inks. Oil products are everywhere. Well, in the future, instead of pulling that out of the ground and producing an awful lot of carbon dioxide in those petrochemical feedstocks, we could actually get a fair amount of that from agricultural products. Once again, Canadian research is currently going into how can we use biological outputs from the farming community, from the agricultural sector, to create a lot of the same products that we were having oil used for the last few decades. Farming technology has long been a really key driver in how the agricultural industry works. For example, in the 15th century, anywhere between half and 3/4 of the world's population, depending on what country you were in, were operating inside of the agricultural industry as a result of, well, let's be clear, fossil fuels. Oil and oil products have actually allowed us to power our farm equipment in a way that we can now say that in most countries in the world, it's fewer than 10% of the population is feeding everyone else. This technology hasn't stopped changing, and it will continue to be new, interesting, and innovative. Now, agriculture in terms of greenhouse gases is a net sink because it's actually pulling more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere than the greenhouse gases that it's emitting. But agriculture can do even more in the future, and the rest of the world is going to need agriculture to step up because you can. People always ask me what's the best source of energy, and the answer is, with time, the tendency is really pretty clear. We're getting a more and more diverse energy mix. So while we do need to reduce the amount of coal, the amount of oil products, and the amount of natural gas, those are never going away. We're going to need it all, because as we go forward, energy will continue to be an important part of our way of life. Why do I like nuclear so much? Well, nuclear is my favorite form of generating electricity. It's a good way of doing it in a lot of situations, partially because it has such a small footprint. We're going to need all the room we can for the agriculture that we need moving forward. Now, some forms of renewable energy work better with agriculture than others. For example, if you want to produce 1 gigawatt of electricity, by way of comparison, Saskatchewan's entire electrical grid is 4 gigawatts. So for 1/4 of Saskatchewan's electricity, here's the amount of space you would need for a hydro plant. Here's the amount of space you would need for a solar plant. And here's the amount of space you would need for a wind farm for 1 gigawatt of electricity. To be clear, you can put wind farms on agricultural land, which all of you know, and you can sometimes put solar on agricultural land, which I'm sure all of you know, and I'm sure that you've figured out that, truthfully, hydro and, say, grazing cattle don't work real well together unless the hydropower plant is a river and maybe the cows can swim really well. But hydroelectric power plants actually take up a very large amount of space compared to nuclear. Now, this little tiny green box right here is the entire space that you need for nuclear, including the mine, the actual plant itself, and the deep geologic repository, which Canada is currently putting into place in order to deal with all of the spent fuel. It's interesting that in all of Canada, using nuclear power for the past several decades, only 1 deep geologic repository is currently being sought because only 1 is necessary. And quite strangely, to everybody outside of the nuclear industry, people are fighting over who gets the right to bury nuclear waste in their backyard. I've often been asked, yeah, well, would you let nuclear waste be buried in your backyard? Yes, I would. I would raise my family next to a nuclear power plant. I would also raise my family on top of a nuclear waste repository. So going forward in our future, we need matter and energy now, and we will in the future too. So what's going to happen in the future? Well, we can electrify just about everything. We can electrify our industrial, our commercial, and our residential energy use. But it's going to be quite difficult to electrify our transportation. Not impossible. It's certainly something that we're seeing, but electricity isn't particularly well suited for that. Nor is electricity well suited to be the matter feedstock for all the adhesives, carpeting, cosmetics, fertilizers, paints, rubber, fabrics, plastics. We're going to need some other source of carbon, something that maybe you can actually help with.